So we're pretty pleased that we positioned ourselves well in being students of the transition, more importantly, being students of commodity markets. Transition or no transition, we're involved in markets that have some commercial relevance, and we'll continue to expand and adapt accordingly.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome to the State of Play in Battery Metals on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abaxx Technologies. Our guest today is Dan McElduff, President at Abaxx Exchange. We'll be discussing the evolving commercial needs of the battery metals markets and how Abaxx is applying the approach Dan learned at the NYMEX to design and launch physically deliverable futures contracts for nickel sulfate and lithium carbonate. Hello, Dan. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Thanks for including me, Dave. It's always a pleasure.
Well, really glad to be starting the year off with you. On this podcast, of course, we talk about how to build smarter markets, and a big part of that is what you're doing at Abaxx Exchange through the design and launching of new futures contracts. This week, you launched the first battery metals futures contract at Abaxx Exchange for nickel sulfate, physically deliverable in Singapore, and you plan on following that in short order with a series of 3 lithium carbonate futures contracts, physically deliverable in either Singapore, Rotterdam, or Baltimore. So I guess a good place to start off would be asking you, why have you chosen to focus on these markets? Now, what commercial need do you see that's not being met by existing products?
So whenever we're looking at markets to address, at our origins, we committed ourselves to focusing on opportunities in emerging markets. So because of EV use, the transition, these materials have come into focus for lots of reasons, but primarily for purposes of EVs and for utility scale storage power. So while the materials have been around for a while and have been used in different use cases, the use cases are new. So we do classify these as emerging, and they fit into our overall mission. And then we get into the basic criteria of why develop a futures contract. And you got to look at scale. Is the market for the underlying, is it big enough or is it going to be big enough? And I think in the case of battery metals, the opportunity lies more in the perspective of how important batteries are going to be in the energy mix in the future. And that's where we see the opportunity. So it's not so much the scale of today as it is where it's going. The volatility profile of the good, does it meet that basic criteria? And considering the supply chain, the need to develop significant amount of resources, if some of the projections for demand for these materials come to be true, there's no doubt there's going to be volatility, and that's just in the development of the capacity. Throw in the other factors that are going to impact volatility, like geopolitics, and it's very clear these materials are going to be influenced by those things, and that there's going to be underlying volatility, the kind of which is the cause for there to be a need to manage risk and develop products like this. The commercial importance is going to be really what is the role of electrification in the transition, the dynamics of the market. Nickel sulfate and lithium products that we're developing and the forms that we're developing, they have had use in the past, but those uses are going to grow, or because of the use case of batteries, that's going to grow. And there's going to be logistical issues where these were perhaps small niche markets. Even to date, the logistical issues are going to grow, and the other factors of volatility and scale are going to attract new market participants in, those who specialize in dealing with those logistical issues. And is there a market demand for the derivatives? It was good that we didn't have to go out and seek whether there was demand for these. There were parties coming to us saying that a new approach to things, and particularly focused on these new use cases for these materials is welcome. And, we saw very clearly that there was an opportunity here for us. And kind of early in our development, it was nice, but this was amongst the first of the incoming requests for us to look into something. So we'll take this approach with all the markets that we deal with. And it just so happens that battery metals align quite well with our founding principles.
And these markets have, as you said, been rapidly evolving with the increased use of these commodities in batteries for electric vehicles, for grid scale storage. In nickel, the production has rapidly become dominated by China and Indonesia. Government policy and regulations in the United States and European Union are still evolving. The mix and the forms of metals used in batteries is also changing as these markets scale. So I wanted to ask you, how do you approach designing a futures contract for a market that's so dynamic? It's a moving target, right?
We like dynamic markets. It's the core of whether a futures market is necessary or not. As many a wise person has said, challenges present opportunities, and it's never more true than it is in our business. The dynamics of the nickel market in the battery metal use case is that emerged as the target, and we've determined the target is big enough, but as you note, it's moving. And while our development effort has shifted over the few years we've been at it, our approach is to embrace those dynamics that are playing out. I think the most important being how Western supply chains had to develop to address, I think a good word for it is the neglect of the past decades. The West has really exported or outsourced its capacity for various reasons, whether it be cost, whether it be don't want to develop these capacity in our backyards for environmental reasons, whatever it may be. Things have shifted, and of course, the bickering and the finger pointing of why that has occurred is all at the heart of the politics. And the politics and capital investment will contribute to the dynamics of this market and to price volatility. So we want to give players in the space as precise an ability to discover price as is possible. And if we're successful in doing that, then we'll endeavor to attract, or success attracts the kind of attention that results in liquidity, which parties need to manage their risk. So we're quite confident in our approach to addressing regional nuances in a portfolio of contracts is how best to address this while also maintaining certain standards across those portfolios. It's important that a futures contract introduces as much standardization as possible. Our approach to this and our portfolio approach to this, which will apply with nickel sulfate when our complete system is in place and will also apply in our lithium solutions, is all intended to make it easier for everyone to enjoy the benefits that come from properly designed contracts that properly capture in as much scale and scope as possible those dynamics and generating prices.
I wanted to ask you, because I often find there's a misperception that the futures markets, the derivatives markets are almost like a sideshow to the physical market, when really there's a complementarity, interrelationship between the two. And I wanted to ask you, what role do you see physically deliverable futures contracts playing in guiding and supporting the development of the underlying physical markets over time?
The battery material markets are to some degree emerging, as I said. If you consider that capacity is either concentrated, well, it's in the case of nickel sulfate, it's quite concentrated in one part of the world. In the case of all of them, for those who adhere to the idea that electrification is the way to go in transition, then there needs to be very dynamic growth in that. And the closer we can get to how the physical market is operating, the better we will be with regards to precision and price discovery. And our approach to design seeks to align wherever we can with that. And I think it's pretty well known for those who know Abaxx that we are pretty dedicated to the concept of physically delivered futures contracts because they yield in one place the price discovery and ability to shift risk all in one model, all in the same form of trading of that standard contract. So we, to date, and this is particularly the case in Western-oriented markets. The markets have not been served by physically delivered contracts. And we need to establish something that people can have faith in, have trust in, and that they can begin to align their contracting practices in their normal business, right? In any emerging market, you have cases where parties have to rely on bank financing to do their investments in production of the good and or in their procurement plans if they're processors or if that's a critical input to their systems. If you're a battery manufacturer, how am I going to contract to obtain the materials I need to build the batteries, to build the cars? They're relying on the bank financing approach, which is quite expensive. If they're going to transition from that safe, relatively expensive environment, they need something that they can have faith in. And the quickest path to a useful mechanism for price discovery is a physically delivered futures contract, because we use the term it's a market of last resort. It's where parties will go with that marginal unit of supply and demand. And that is something that people could trust, even in the early days of a futures contract, because it's in the absence of it, everybody really is wondering what the price is. So as it is, as I started off saying, we consider these in emerging markets, and we think that this kind of contract design and a physically delivered product is very important in helping that market set its foundation properly.
Now, Dan, you've been a student and a practitioner of the art of futures contract design for many decades, learning your approach to designing these physically deliverable futures at the NYMEX. Some might say that's becoming a lost art as financially centered contracts have become the norm. That said, you learned your approach predominantly in the energy markets, and metals markets have always been a bit of a different animal than the energy markets. So you also bring a little bit of an outsider's perspective. It might be a little too strong, but what I was curious about was, as you've kind of come in designing these contracts for battery metals like nickel sulfate and lithium, what do you think the metals markets can learn from and adopt from the practices in the energy markets? And what are you looking to do differently in your battery metals futures contracts than people may be accustomed to in the metals markets?
It's as close as I'll ever come to being accused of being an artist. And taking a look at it, the energy markets from a historical perspective in the commodities futures industry are the new kids on the block. The old kids, including ags, base metals, precious metals, even sovereign bond futures, followed a design structure that persists in those markets, which didn't work for energy markets and may not be a necessity in the markets that we've developed. So there are two factors that I think distinguish the energy markets that my mentors and colleagues developed that influenced me in the process of contract design and I think have been well adapted by Abaxx. The first relates to what I'd say the timing of convergence between the forward futures markets and the spot market. And in almost all of those older contracts that I mentioned, the delivery process happens in cycles in daily increments across a month. It kind of stretches the process of convergence out across a pretty long period. And that didn't really work for the oil markets, which were the first to employ this kind of design in the US. And in those contracts, the maturity of a contract happens, in the last trading day. And that point of convergence of pricing between the futures forward market and the spot market happens then, not across a series of days. And I think that brings a great deal of focus in pricing, which is surely improves hedge effectiveness and precision of pricing. A second thing is that, wherever what I call the warehouse approach to delivery is used, and I think that applies almost in all those markets that I mentioned before, maybe not so much in sovereign bonds, but you have to qualify the good in a warehouse receipt system. And then you end up trading warehouse receipts or warrants. That introduces some challenges. I've argued that can introduce artificial constraints in delivery. And in some cases, the goods in question behind those warrants are not the goods that are actually flowing and being used by end users. It's almost as if those things are in the system just to make the derivative markets work. So why not align directly with how the goods that are being used in end use processes are delivered? That's kind of our guiding principle. And it was born out of necessity in the oil industry. And as I teased my metals colleagues back in my days at NYMEX, the COMEX guys, I scratched my head, not wondering why more energy-like methods were not used. And of course, the answer is these things were developed at a different time. And it could be that the use case requires that kind of delivery structure. But we've taken this approach so far. It seems to be well received. Generally speaking, those are two areas where we've employed practices that, I learned in the energy markets into what we're doing in battery metals.
Yeah, and I was curious how it's been received because often people don't like change. You said it's been well received, but what has been the reception to your approach from metals traders? Any pushback or any welcome?
We align the mechanism through all the interviews we did with the way folks are doing business. And battery metals, fortunately, are a great example for us to test this out because they lean on a standardized delivery system, which is, if not the biggest and most standardized, through shipping container systems. So while sellers may pull from their inventories, they'll have to tender material that is ready to move and not locked up in warehouse processes. And that's kind of the narrative that we presented to folks. And we have so much knowledge and experience on our management team when it comes to metals. And we tested these theories, yourself included, in these discussions pretty vigorously before we went out. And we're quite pleased that they were well received in this industry. And I think it's the uniqueness of the goods that we've designed these contracts for. They don't have long shelf lives. It aligns well with, if there are markets that are well aligned with this approach to it, I think these are them, the battery metals.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Like Josh Crum had brought it up when he was on over the past couple of weeks, how we call these battery metals, but in many regards, they're a little bit more like specialty chemicals that have a much different physical attributes than you would see with a cathode or just like a bar. And I'm curious, when you look at kind of the underlying physical characteristics, you mentioned that, a little bit with shorter shelf life. How do the underlying physical characteristics and how the supply chain works make this type of delivery structure more aligned to what people are doing than a warehouse?
The good thing is there's pretty well established and I think fast, quickly emerging methods of creating a standard product, right? When we endeavored into this, we were concerned that the range of specifications would be so broad, it'd be hard to get people focused on what grade or quality specification would be useful. I recall back to the days of coal futures market design where the grades that came out of the ground were so different and there wasn't a need or a reality where you had to turn that stuff into some kind of standardized product. It was all going to the same place for the same purpose. The quality differentials, there wasn't a need to process them to a point of standardization. And in these markets, there is because they all make these batteries that are pretty standard from unit to unit. So the good news is this market and the capacity around it has driven towards standards that we could align with, and that would cover a big part of the market and include in it, not just a sample, but perhaps a significant part of the population of the goods that are being moved, right? So we're not dealing with a lot of basis risk when it comes to quality specifications. And the standardization process in this case, in these markets for in nickel and lithium based battery materials has really a level of standardization. And now I think what's being introduced is the scale that comes and the dynamics that come with it. That's what's changing and the contracting practices. How do we price this stuff that's being exchanged between parties that are not just the producer and the consumer, but the parties who are helping with the logistics in the intermediary space.
Yeah, and I want to come back a little bit to the changes in contracting practices or transactions. But first, I wanted to ask you, because I'm glad you brought up some of the experience in the coal markets, because I was curious, when you look at such a dynamic and changing space as battery metals, are there historical precedents that you look to guide to, or do you feel like you're a bit in unknown territory here? Or have we been at this kind of dynamic development in other commodity markets and there might be historical lessons to draw?
Yeah, so the change in the underlying, I was early on in it. I thought this would be quite dynamic and from quality specs and things like that. And the coal experience would make this a very difficult task. It would be a difficult task like the coal experience. I think, as just mentioned, the standardization of this has come together quite quickly into a relatively neat package, both from a standardization of the good and from the simplicity of the delivery system. I call it a simple delivery system, but we know all the crazy things that can happen in the container shipping industry as we've experienced. But I think the real dynamics are in the reconsideration of supply chains and politics around that. That's where I think there's going to be more dynamics in that space than there's going to be in the specifications and the delivery systems. And in any case, we'll need to be nimble in addressing those.
It's safe to say that it's more of a political problem than a technical problem at this stage?
If there are going to be appropriate levels of capacity development in Western markets, then it's going to be a technical issue too, right? And politics and how much we can agree on the status quo or not are going to influence those things.
And I wanted to come back and ask because with launching a successful new futures contract, it's always a difficult and a tricky thing. Most traders will want to sit back and wait for liquidity. But for a contract to gain that liquidity, there has to be those early adopters who will make the first trades and the trade after that and the trade after that, kind of like the first year of trades. From your conversations and working groups and with traders, what do you think those early adopters see that others don't? What makes them different?
Early adopters are the ones that, in the development of these markets, they kind of see the same things we see, right? Is this a commercially important thing? Is it going to scale? Is it going to be worth me making my investment in this market? When I say that, I'm talking about early adopters of futures contracts. They're typically the trading companies that specialize in solving logistics problems without going in too heavily weighted on owning the capacity to solve those problems. And the futures contracts are their friends because they can do contractually what they might achieve physically by owning transport, by owning storage, by owning production facilities. Time and again, it's those trading companies that are employing the skills that they've developed or recognizing that there's arbitrage opportunity for them in an emerging market where the bid ask is quite wide. The opportunity is always the bid ask times the quantity that can be traded. They see that. And as the world evolves, when I started my career, there were not many companies doing that. And now there are so many more, there's so much more capacity. So we can see that the parties entering the market, there's all kinds of indicators, not just the feedback we're getting from people who are coming in. So the incentives for those guys to come in have not changed. And it kind of gives us the confidence that we do to take on our ambitious plans to set things up because we can see them coming. They can agree with us. They can guide us on terms of, and they have, on how we can structure these contracts so that they're useful to them. And then, that's really what kicks off the price discovery process. And, the advantage to them is that they have the real world experience in terms of what are the influences on that bid ask. There's so many things in markets where a layman may look at a bid ask and just see numbers, and a party who's been operating in that kind of capacity I just been talking about, the change from bid quantity from 5 to 6 tells a much bigger story based on the experience that they have and being an early adopter and understanding who are the potential parties that are influencing that quantity on the bid ask and how that relates to some other news or information that they have. So being in at the onset just improves their capabilities, their ability to use their intuition and piece together disparate facts. There's the early adopters that, I don't know if you call them adopters, they're kind of waiting at bay. It's the incumbents in the industry, the producers and the consumers who have always been in that role since the market has evolved. They have the capacity to engage the market more dynamically, but they don't because they're doing quite well in their business. They're making good margins on wide bid asks. But ultimately the trade's going to start getting crowded and they got to shift themselves. So I think those are the kinds of companies that stay close to what firms like us are doing. And then they're gathering the data that an early adopter would, like a trading company. And then they're even better positioned to move into a more dynamic marketplace because they have the position of the incumbent. They may, if they've developed it, have the capacity and the intuition of a trader. And they're very well positioned to get into more advanced techniques like writing options of all sorts, physical, financial derivatives, all those things. The big question is when and how do do these players engage? They're the important ones in our markets that we've developed to date. So far, so good. I think we're attracting the right kinds of attention and people. And in all these cases, we're attracting those types of folks I would throw into the early adopter category.
And I'm curious because I guess in the old days, there used to be some impediments that some companies or traders that may have been active in physical markets might not have had the experience, the systems in place to trade futures. Is that much of an issue anymore, or do most of the companies that you would expect have that knowledge, experience, and capability?
I think every company is different, and even mature industries have the experience that there's pure producers, pure consumers, intermediaries. They're dealing with business at the core level. They don't necessarily want to develop that capacity around derivative trading, right? Which to do it right, you have to put significant risk management capacities into place. That can be costly. You can't outsource this stuff simply by covering your risks in contract. This is not unique in emerging markets like nickel sulfate. I think it's still even in the banking industry, right? Where you have regional banks that may not want to have a big derivative business and hire a risk manager and employ trade capture systems and things like that when they could simply offload their interest rate risk to a larger company that does do that in a swap. And I believe in a model where those dynamics are allowed and a company can choose where to focus its attention, whether it's on its core business of, and bringing it back to battery metals instead of banks, its core business of creating batteries and not having to worry about hiring a Wall Street trader who may command a higher salary than any of its engineers who are innovating in the battery metal space. They could go to their bank. They can change in their favor. They can change the dynamics by saying, we want better financing because we have a hedged inventory or a hedged capital project, and rely on the intermediary's capability to do the blocking and tackling of trading futures and options. I think the metals industry, we still have some degree of flexibility in terms of that happening. Globally, the regulatory capacity and I believe kind of a misguided approach to forcing things in the construct of margin positions at clearinghouses. We do well as in the exchange community. We do well if someone's writing a derivative and they're turning around and hedging it in our clearinghouse, just as well as if that party came directly to the clearinghouse to hedge. And what I think is important is that there's a range and diversity of products that are out there to help people manage their risk, whether they want to hire a trader or not. They should be able to go to someone to do that. And we think where we are from a regulatory perspective and the environments we are, the regulatory structures surrounding, at it in Singapore and in surrounding areas of Asia offer a little bit more flexibility in terms of the kinds of participants who can come in to these metal markets and offer some of those dynamics. I think that's going to be a good thing for the overall market, especially in the case that mining companies and consumers of these goods really have to be focused on doing their jobs well, finding that stuff wherever it may be in the ground and getting the most efficiencies out of it when they build a battery for an EV or for a utility system.
Well, Dan, thanks a lot for making the time to talk with us today. I know it's a busy week for you with getting the products ready for launch. I wanted to ask you before you go, I've heard you say on more than one occasion that futures contracts are living, breathing documents. And with that in mind, I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you're anticipating these contracts may need to continue to evolve? And what forces and changes in the physical markets do you have your eyes and ears open to for the forces and changes in the physical markets that these contracts may need to respond to in the future?
So our contracts are going to need to reflect where the marginal business is happening and be comprehensive enough to support liquidity. So we think the regions we're in generally in the product suites we've developed in the different underlying markets, we're covering the core areas of North America, Europe, and Asia somehow. With nickel sulfate, we're starting with Asia with our nickel sulfate Singapore contract, but the intent is to have a range of contracts. And towards that goal, we want to be able to introduce standardization. All the contracts are designed very much the same. but the supply sources of them and the demand dynamics in each of them are going to be different. And the dynamics, as I said, in politics are going to, we think, highlight the need to take that regional approach, right? Because then those price differentials will tell us that there's some difference that is a benefit to others and a cost to their counterparts. Why do they exist? Can they be resolved? And it'll be a guide for a lot of reasons. We know that's going to change. Right now, we're very well positioned with the design that we have, but the dynamics could change. We got to move with that. In our broader product slate, here's the big question in the energy transition, right? Conventional wisdom is that the electrification of the system is the solution. Someone might innovate, and I wouldn't rule this out, how to put a contraption on a tailpipe and a big chunk of the emissions problem goes away. Then it's a different dynamic, different materials going into that unit. So it may be that our product slate has to change from an underlying perspective, and we'll just keep our fingers on the pulse of that. And to some degree, the demand for our products is going to be somewhat of an indicator for in which direction the transition is going. So we're pretty pleased that we positioned ourselves well in being students of the transition, more importantly, being students of commodity markets. Transition or no transition, we're involved in markets that have some commercial relevance, and we'll continue to expand and adapt accordingly.
Thanks again to Dan McElduff, President at Abaxx Exchange. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of The State of Play in Battery Metals. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abaxx.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abaxx. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abaxx Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.